Longfellow Middle School with the Longfellow Rangers, an after-school environmental stewardship program. And you can move to the next slide. So we have lots of fun topics to cover with you tonight, and hopefully they will give you ideas and resources for you to get outside with your students during the winter months. You take a quick look at that before we move on to the next slide. They're kind of general, but we are going to delve into some more detail in each of these categories. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so before we get started and enter into some breakout rooms, I just want to review some of the norms for our session this evening and remind you to keep your mics muted while we are in the whole, when we are gathering on as a whole group. And you are free to keep your camera on or off during that time. But when we do enter into the breakout sessions, we would ask that you please unmute yourself and turn your camera on so that you can fully engage in the small group learning. We are going to be monitoring the chat throughout. You're welcome to add comments or questions in the chat, and we will try and get to them as they are available for us to answer. We are also going to have a couple of points in the program where you will be able to ask questions, so you might think about holding them as well. We are recording this, and we are also going to make the slide deck available to you through Schoology at the end of the presentation. Okay, you can go ahead and move on.
You can tell them the activity that they're doing here.
What's that, Chrissy? I can hear you.
So you can explain the activity they're going to do in the breakout?
Yeah, well, in the breakout room, it's going to be a time for mainly for discussion based on some of the material that we're presenting. And there will be, oh, I'm sorry, with this breakout room, please introduce yourself. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Please introduce yourself and your school and your role and your favorite cold weather activity or one thing you enjoy about the winter landscape. So you'll have 10 minutes to meet with people in your room and share these pieces of information. And we'll see you when you come back. So this is, so we can, like, I can.
All right, Karen, you have everyone back.
Yay. Okay, you can pop up. Thank you. Thank you for the next slide. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed connecting and reconnecting with one another and hearing a little bit about what each of you enjoys about winter. And that leads us into the next topic, which is embracing friluftsliv. So I challenge you just to take a stab at that word, friluftsliv. It is not the easiest thing to pronounce, and I know because I have been practicing it for days in preparation for this presentation. And it is a Norwegian word, and it actually means open air life, and it embodies a love of nature and spending time outdoors as a way of life. In Scandinavian countries, at this time of year, daylight is definitely in short supply. And in some areas, the sun doesn't rise for 2 months. So people have had to adapt to that and actually have quite a positive winter mindset. And they do see winter as a special time of year full of opportunities for outdoor enjoyment. So I'm hoping that we can learn from them and adopt that mindset as well, and use that to approach learning outdoors in the cold. So we're going to explore some ways to embrace it, be invigorated, and have some fun while learning. So, of course, the first thing to ensure a positive outdoor learning experience in winter is to be prepared. And it seems like that is very common sense, to dress for the weather, to think about dressing in layers, particularly if it does get quite cold. But we also know that our students may come to school not appropriately dressed, or will have forgotten an essential piece of clothing that will make them feel more comfortable being outdoors. So you may want to think about rounding up some of those lost and found gloves and hats and maybe even jackets before they get donated on, and hanging on to them through the season so that they're available for some students who may not have access to them or may have forgotten to bring them to school that day. The other thing is, you want to keep in mind that standing still outside in the cold is not fun. So you want to plan for a lot of movement. And even prior to going outside, you may think of doing some warm-up exercises, or doing that as soon as you come out the door to get everybody prepared for your learning activity, whether it's maybe running in place or doing some jumping jacks, or even starting to think about planning a longer route to your site where you're going to do your lesson and doing a quick walk out there. The other key tip I would say is to really plan on doing a lot more observation and not focus so much on writing things down while you're outside. Focusing on doing an investigation and close looking is really what's going to make your outdoor time memorable. So you might want to think about encouraging that inquiry and spontaneous investigation, and using those see, think, wonder routines. And saving the writing perhaps for when you return indoors. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Okay, so we have some examples of winter landscape. So oftentimes when we think of winter landscapes, our imaginations like to kind of run towards the picture on the left. And in Northern Virginia, that may not be as common, although maybe this year we may be proven wrong about that. The predictions are for a little bit more snow, so maybe we'll have opportunities to do some observations in the snow. But more often than not, our scenery and our landscape looks more like the picture on the right. But both of them provide really excellent opportunities for doing some observations of the environment in winter. So I'd invite you to take a look at both of those photos and see what strikes you first, and see what you notice first. And think about your students, and perhaps, thanks, Shannon. Think about the things that your students might be observing. And it may not be visual. It may also be a feel or a scent or something that they hear. So maybe you're looking at these photos and observing the silhouette or structure of the trees. Or maybe you are noticing that evergreen on the right-hand side standing out in the background there. And that may be something that you might not have noticed when all of the trees were fully leafed out. Or maybe your eye comes to the plants in the front of the photo, which are actually part of a pollinator garden, something that we will discuss at more length later on in the presentation. But think about what are the parts of those plants. There's probably a lot of seed heads. And think about, if you're seeing seed heads on plants, what are other observations you might get to make by looking at plants like that? To me, that is an ideal spot to maybe do some bird observations. Okay, you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So games and scavenger hunts are great ways to help students explore and learn about the natural environment. And scavenger hunts can be done individually, or students can work in pairs or small groups to find some selected items. So here are some examples of different types of scavenger hunts. One is more simple, the other one is a little bit more detailed. So for younger students, you might want to include pictures along with words. And for older students, you might even want to include some scientific nomenclature or botanical names. It's a good way of introducing some scientific language to older students. And even by way of looking at things you might collect. If you look at the simpler examples, you see a pine cone, and students can collect pine cones. But an older class, you might want to differentiate and have them collect a variety of pine cones, say looking for spruce cones or maybe white pine cones, and comparing and contrasting the structure of those, and noting that they are one way of identifying the trees that they came from. And perhaps they can look to see which trees they belong to. And then again, noticing the difference in the structures. They're very different needle structures and the way the needles are bundled between a white pine and a spruce tree. The other thing to take into account is that you don't really have to collect anything when you go out. You can use some laminated sheets and just use dry erase markers, or use a checklist. But you don't need to collect anything, although you may decide to do that. Although there are some things that you want to be sure that you don't collect. I'm not advised to pick them up, and I would probably stay away from collecting birds' nests or messing with spider webs, or maybe a shell fungus on a tree. They're wonderful to look at, but I would let them be. But other things that are on the ground, like the pine cones or pine needles, or perhaps some stones or different seed pods, which there are quite a few different types laying around the ground right now, would be fun to collect and look at more closely when you return to the classroom. So some other good ideas for observing outside without actually doing a scavenger hunt is to just take a sensory walk. Again, this doesn't require doing a lot of writing, but it can really heighten the senses and awareness of the environment around you, and paying attention to the sense and the sounds and the feel of the air around you, or anything that you might touch, like maybe the bark of a tree, for example. And then when you return indoors, you could encourage your students to do some nature journaling about the experiences that they had while walking, or maybe create some winter poetry, or even do a winter story. And speaking of stories, I wanted to add that it would be a great idea to share with students the fact that many Native cultures use this time of year traditionally to do storytelling. And you might even think about hosting a storytelling circle outside after your students have completed your writing. Make some good use of those tree stumps that many of you have in your courtyards and outdoor learning spaces. And I will note that when you receive the slide deck, there is a reference for the American Indian Museum that does provide some information on Native American storytelling and the tradition of storytelling in winter. It's kind of an interesting resource to take a look at. Okay, we'll move to the next slide, please. Okay, so scavenger hunts can be easily created and adapted to all kinds of habitats and ecosystems, depending on where you are on your school grounds. And they can also be very specific or themed. You can just do a tree walk or a bird observation. I took a look at some of these pictures that I put up, and I thought, you could actually do a green walk by looking at some of these pictures, because there are some plants and items on here that are still green through winter. And that's the cool thing about where we live. Actually, there are a lot of things that we can observe in our area, which you might not notice any other time of the year. For example, that club moss, you probably wouldn't see until about this time of year. And I'd also draw attention to the picture on the upper right-hand corner. So yes, it's a tree. And I would say everybody in this session is familiar with deciduous and evergreen trees. But if you're out on a tree walk, have you noticed that not all of the trees have lost their leaves? And there is a term for that, and these are marcescent trees. And marcescent trees, marcescence means that the trees retain their leaves through winter. And I know that many schools have different, we have a couple different species of trees that don't lose their leaves. The beeches and the oaks retain them. And interestingly, scientists really don't know the reasons why the trees retain their leaves, which I find fascinating. But there are a lot of theories around that, some of which are that it provides insulation for birds, or when they do drop later on in the spring, that it provides additional mulch around the ground of the tree, particularly in dry areas, but none of that has been scientifically proven. The other thing that I wanted to share a story as I was looking at these slides as well, it was the slide that shows the redbud pods. So this fall, I had the opportunity to go out with some first graders in their courtyard, and we were looking at specifically at deciduous and evergreen trees. And this redbud tree looked pretty much like it does in this picture. And I asked the students what they observed, and they thought that what they saw were leaves and that they were dead and that the tree was dead. So we came very close to the tree and took a closer observation. And sure enough, they were the seed pods of the trees. So just taking a couple of those pods off and breaking them open for the students to see the seeds inside, they were fascinated by it. But it was one of those things that dispelled the notion that what they thought it was actually was not what they thought it was. So at this point, I'm going to have you go back into your breakout rooms and have a little discussion about some of what you're seeing in these pictures, and maybe thinking back onto your school grounds and the things that you might see, the areas you might further explore. Maybe there's a wooded edge near one of your fields, or even in your courtyard if you have one. There are some things that you might observe, like that Christmas fern is green at this time of year. And I know many school gardens have that planted because it is a native plant. So we're going to pop back in for about 4 or 5 minutes for you to continue your conversations about observations around your school grounds. Noted the mistletoe, because we do have quite a bit of it around this area, and I didn't know if anyone was familiar with it or had noticed it anywhere around their schools. I do notice it myself in areas, in some wooded areas that are really close to major intersections, and I'm not sure why that is, but I do know that it is around. And you may not notice it because you'll just see this big green globe of foliage and think that it's actually part of the tree. But if you look a little bit more closely, you'll notice that nothing else is leaping out. So it could be mistletoe. So anyway, I'm hoping that you heard a lot of different ideas about winter observations. And to share our learning, I'm going to use a processing structure called Wait Chat. And I'm going to ask you to write one idea for a winter's observation in the chat box, but don't hit enter yet. You'll have 60 seconds to type in your answer. And then when I say go, everyone's going to enter their observation at the same time. So I'm thinking, Chrissy, you have the timer.
I have the timer started.
Okay,
Everyone
start
type in
the
the chat.
timer.
Could you please repeat the question of what we're supposed to be typing? I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. No, you're going to write one idea for a winter observation in the chat box.
Don't hit enter yet. You have 34 more seconds. And then we'll all hit enter at the same time. It's okay, Brooke. You were just a good example for people that weren't sure what to write. . Excellent. A bonus one. We appreciate it.
Bonus one, it's excellent.
All right, in 10 seconds. And enter. So many great examples.
What is a dray? Great question. Would anybody like to answer that question? There you go. So being that I do not have the ability to see all of the things come through, but they did come flying through, maybe Allie, can you give us some examples of what you're seeing?
Sure, we had some good ideas. So we had different kinds of trees, invasive species, animal tracks, bird sounds, listening for different patterns in bird sounds, doing sensory walks, looking for berries and insects, using pine cones to create bird feeders and attracting more birds to your area. If you can find owl pellets out, look under some trees, and looking for leaves in different colors. The color palette is so different in winter, so really paying attention to that, and also the angle of the sun in the sky and differences in lighting. Erosion, snowflakes. If we get some snowflakes this year, more than the few that some people reported today. Temperature, weather. There's no shortage of things that we can observe over the
Okay, so
winter.
who said nothing is happening out in that winter landscape? Okay, oh, tracking sunrise and sunset times, that's excellent, excellent. Okay, I guess we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so winter is also a great time to make note of phenological changes to dispel that notion that nothing is happening in the winter landscape. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, phenology is kind of described as nature's calendar. And what it does is it studies the timing of biological events in relationship to climate variation. So examples of phenological events would be the timing of when birds migrate, butterflies migrate, when buds break or flowers begin to bloom. There also freeze and thaw cycles are indications of, and then it's how we decide when our frost and freeze dates are. And they're really being increasingly noted for monitoring climate change rather than relying on the calendar to expect certain things to occur. So I wanted to, many of you are probably familiar, maybe some are not, with Journey North, but Journey North is a site that provides great connection with our Portrait of a Graduate attribute of global and ethical citizenship, and offers a lot of opportunities for students to do collection of and contribution of phenological observations, which are used to contribute to the understanding of conservation and protection of migratory and wildlife species. So some of the categories that you can get your students involved in monitoring and observing would be different species of birds. And the monarch butterflies is one that is really popular and aligns with our curriculum and is a great way for students to make observations and report them. And the thing that's really nice about Journey North is you get to share the information with others around the country and take note of the times that what we are seeing here and when they're happening in other areas of the country. So I wanted you to take a look at these pictures and see if you can identify what the phenological phenomenon are. I think some of them will be pretty self-evident. In the upper left-hand corner, it's a good example of a bird migration, a huge flock. I don't know what the species is, but you can definitely see something like that happen in some of our shoreline areas where there's not as many trees obstructing. There are quite a few, and you might be able to see that on some of our school grounds as well. Yeah, it does look like a starling migration. You're right, Allie. Thank you. The second picture is a good example of bud break and a flower burst on a witch hazel plant. And the third picture, you can see that student in the back there holding a sheet of ice, which happened at the first freeze of the season. And I'd like you to take a really close look at the picture all the way to the right. So that is a picture of some snowdrops, which are very, very early spring blooming bulbs. They actually bloom in the winter more so than the spring. But if you look closely, you might see that there is a honeybee visiting that snowdrop. And I wanted to share with you that this picture was taken this past January. So what that picture would tell me is that the temperature had gotten up around 50 degrees because that is about the temperature that bees will become active in the hive. Now it's January, so if they're going to be leaving the hive to look for food, they're not going to find a whole lot around. So thankfully these little snowdrops are providing some pollen and nectar sources for them to take back to their hive. Oh, that sounds great. Thanks, Kate. So you can move to the next slide, please, which is one that we're very excited about. So I hope that as we're talking about all of these opportunities to get outside in winter, encourages you to get excited about taking your students out and to help you with that, those observations. We are so excited to announce that Get to Green has nature observation kits now available for you to check out. So they're wonderful for, again, for scavenger hunts or for doing birding or lots of other observations. You can see on the graphic to the left what is included in the kit. And they're generally designed to provide tools for one class to go out and perhaps work in pairs or small groups. There are 15 sets of binoculars included in the sets, along with instructions on how to use everything. And if you are interested in having one of these kits delivered to your school, you can fill out a request form, which is will be on the slide that you can check the link to, or Chrissy, I think you're going to put the link to it in the chat.
Already there.
Okay, so you can click that link. So these are ready to sign up for, and perhaps after the break, you can get yourself prepared to go out and do some outdoor winter learning. And we are looking forward to these kits being very well used. Okay, and you can move to the next slide. So we are at the point where I had the extreme pleasure to introduce Kate Carey to you. She is an Arlington Master Naturalist, and I got to know Kate a little bit through her work over at Longfellow Middle School, where I think it was during the pandemic that she got the group going, an after-school group to keep students engaged doing outdoor learning. And she has a whole bunch of topics that she is going to share with you this evening. So you can go ahead and move to the next slide. And I'm just
actually keep this
keep
slide
it?
for 1 second.
Okay.
And I'm just going to mention that a lot of times I put my lesson plans up on the Twitter handle. This is the fastest way for me to put them out. So if you want to see what middle schoolers are doing each week, just check on that. I also have that website that might be a helpful resource for some people. Okay, next slide. So I'm really impressed by the comments, and I can tell a lot of you already know what a Master Naturalist is from the comments. But a Master Naturalist is aligned with the Master Gardeners, and it comes out of Virginia Tech. We're a volunteer group, and working in schools is a big area of interest for us, education outreach. The programming varies by region. So further west, you have multiple counties together, but out here, counties are separated. And our counties are very interested in invasive removal. That's a big priority for us. The quality of Master Naturalists can vary. And if you're working with one and they're not giving you the answers you'd like or the expertise you need, just diplomatically ask for a Master Naturalist in that expertise area, and they can go back to the message board and ask for someone else to come out. I do that all the time myself. I became a Master Naturalist during the pandemic, and I started a virtual Longfellow Rangers after school club on Fridays, and now it's in person. And the kids I draw are generally like me. They're kids who have parents that are not taking them outside, but they have that interest. My son also became a Master Naturalist because he fell in love with Professor Doug Talmey from the University of Delaware. And he enjoyed his discussion of how native plants support our insects and our mammals. And I just want to give a plug. Being a Master Naturalist has been a game changer for my family and all of our lives. My husband sits on the back deck and tells me all the birds that we have in our backyard. So everybody's better off now that we have some Master Naturalists. Next slide. So I tried to pick some topics that apply to all age ranges, and we can make basic for the younger kids and more advanced for the older kids. So we're going to go through lichen, buds, birding, and night skies. Next slide. Okay. Lichen was this really fun, surprising event for my kids. They fell in love with it. So lichen is so easy because you just need a magnifying glass and you can get out there. And it also encourages students to look at things up close and realize there's so many things happening that they never noticed before. Because in the next slide, which we're not going to go to yet, you're going to see lichen up close and you'll be kind of amazed if you haven't looked at it before. The other thing I like about lichen is I can bring samples into the classroom with me if I'm feeling nervous that the property I'm on doesn't have enough lichen. And I just want to take a second to show you that bottom right slide. You see those white spots on the brick? That's some lichen. And then where the person has the flashlight and it's glowing, that's a species indicator for the type of lichen that you're seeing there. So there's so many fun things to do with lichen. Next slide. Okay, so other people call it this, but my kids naturally called it this as well. They're like, oh my gosh, this is like looking at coral. But to see that level of coral, you have to take those hand magnifiers out with you and really look. Some kids or teachers can use their iPhones. I guess you don't want your kids doing that. The lichen, as someone noted in the comments, are two organisms. The primary one is fungus, and the secondary one is most of the time an alga, although sometimes there's bacteria or other elements. While lichen looks like it's a plant, it's actually not a plant at all. Fungus, as you know, because you're all very educated, is more closely related to humans than to plants. And they grow on trees and rocks and all, sometimes they're growing on your car. Next slide. With lichen, you can keep it really simple. You don't, when you talk about trees, the kids are just constantly nagging you. What tree is that? What tree is this? What leaf is this? But they kind of let it go with lichen, which is great for you. So you can keep it simple and just get them to adore looking at the different structures that they're seeing. And the best part about it is that they'll tell you, I've been walking by that stuff my whole life and I had no idea what it was. So it really brightens them up when they realize they know something, you know, special about the world that they didn't realize before. So you just shared a big woodland secret with them. Next slide. It's a myth, as we've been discussing, that winter is the dormant time. In actuality, a lot of ways, August is the most dormant time. But the winter is not a dormant time because the trees are getting prepped for spring. So you can keep bud watching, really simple. You can just go out and observe with the kids and ask them to look. Again, it does help if you have some magnifying glasses, if possible, to take out with the kids. So what you're seeing here is actually from my own yard. That's a maple tree, and I just did increasing magnification with some light. So another thing you can do with children is pick a tree. The kids, like if you're working with little kids, you could have them vote on the tree that they want to follow and go out once a week and snap a photo and follow the buds through week by week and then line them up and show the kids. You could get a little more complicated by starting to really notice what's happening with the buds, compare, contrast different trees and different types of buds. And then you could get fancy by using more formal botany terms and, as someone mentioned in the chat, dichotomous keys, which even my middle school kids are able to use dichotomous keys and actually find them really fun and interesting to use. What I do is put them in a big group and we read them out together, and that keeps everybody on board and focused. And then we each pick the next answer we want to go to. So what I did with the maple from my yard is the middle picture shows it really up close. It shows that same section over towards the right side of the left picture. And then I sliced it and I show you what it looks like inside the forming bud. Next slide. Winter tree ID. Tree ID is really fun. That's the dichotomous key I was talking about a second ago. And I want you to go out there and focus on looking, touching. It's so important to take the time and make sure every kid has a second to come up and touch the bark. And I know we're talking about wintertime, but if the leaves are up, to actually touch the leaf and feel how thick it is, because those are all different by tree. And then it's going to sound funny, although some people were commenting about this, sniff. So some trees are species indicated by the smell. So if you take something like spice bush, which is technically a bush, but a small tree, and you go up to it and you have a sense that that's a spice bush and you scratch a twig and sniff it, then you know what you have, because it'll have a spicy citrus smell. Another one is sassafras. Sassafras is such a unique smell system that the colonists noted in their journals. And what's fun about sassafras is the bark smells like cinnamon, the roots smell like root beer, and in fact it used to be used for root beer, and its leaves and stems smell like sweet lemon. So there's other trees that are indicated by scent, and the dichotomous tree guides often indicate what those are, but you can also just have fun with the kids going out there and experimenting. Next slide. Winter birding. So it's only in the midst of summer that you have your regrets that you didn't start birding in the wintertime, because the trees are so full of leaves that you can't find the birds. So this is a great time to get out and start birding, even though that might not be initially intuitive. Okay, birds are,
Have to take that on.
I have it here, but it's just, okay, birding is the most common pathway for people to become naturalists. Because when you go out with birding, first you learn the birds, then you start to wonder what trees the birds are frequently on, and you realize certain birds pair with certain trees. Then you start to learn the insects. And so it's just a great way for everybody, but especially kids, to start a path towards becoming a naturalist. In our area, there's a lot of free opportunities to learn how to bird with qualified naturalists. I'd say it's the easiest way for families that don't have a big budget to get their kids out with a qualified person outside with enthusiastic adults learning. So it's highly cost efficient. And I have some handouts that will be available at the end of our discussion in the pack. This pack of information that'll have more detailed information about how to start getting into birding. I also want to talk about Merlin. Merlin is an app that you're going to get on your phone, and it has an amazing feature where you can go outside and record bird sounds, and it'll list for you what you're hearing. And it's remarkably accurate. I'm going to say that apparently in 2020, when it was starting to launch, it was not so accurate, but it is scaled up so much. And this will give you a lot of confidence when you take those kids out there. If you're not a birder and you're worried and you know they're going to be asking a lot of questions, so just pull it out of your pocket, show them how it works, and say, I'm going to use this. And we're going to put it up here and listen to the birds and see what we get. Just today, I had some kids out and we had a pileated woodpecker, but honestly, it was hard for me to see because of the backlighting on the bird. So that's how we were able to ID it. And I also want to add that my kids, I've been at this now for 4 years, are really getting into birding. Some of them have purchased bird feeders with cameras and they're watching birds. So that's just one that just seems really popular and brings kids to my club. And then finally, we're gonna, next slide. We're gonna talk about the night sky. So I am a early to bed, early to rise person. So I love wintertime because I can get out and actually stargaze. And it's great for kids because what I found with my own children is that those teen years, they need so much sleep. I didn't want them staying up particularly late in the summertime. So winter is a great time to get out and encourage your kids. Now I know they're no longer in your possession in their home, but if you give them some reminders, like after dinner, go outside for a little walk. And that can also encourage them to get outside during all times of year. I know that my students frequently tell me they've never seen a deer and they've never seen a fox. And that tells me that they're not going outside enough. So again, if you could stress to them after dinner, go see if you can find certain constellations. So the book that you see over on the right is a great book, very simple. It's done, if you might recognize the illustrations, by the same person who did Curious George. And he fell in love with astronomy and stargazing in World War I and was frustrated that he couldn't figure out what those little star constellations were supposed to look like, that he didn't see a bear. So he redesigned them so they were more obvious. And this book is quite brilliant. So I'm teaching my students just a couple of constellations each week and then having them go out at night. Next slide. So take advantage of these long nights by teaching just a few constellations. Encourage that 10-minute walk after dinner, and hopefully it becomes a year-round habit. And then take some time to discuss light pollution. We're often very dismissive about light pollution because it seems like, well, if next year we just turn off all the lights, we'll undo the damage. But in reality, there's lots of creatures that are highly affected by the constant lights that we have, the street lights, your backyard lights, your holiday lights, to be honest, if you can turn those off. They can be very deadly for insects, for bats, birds flying, and they confuse mammals. So it's just good to take a moment to discuss how it affects our inability to see stars, but what it does to the animals. And then every time you teach about a specific topic like stars or trees, you can often find a professional organization associated with it. So for example, for stargazing, we have the Northern Virginia Astronomy Club, NOVAC, which I believe is the largest astronomy club in the United States. We have tremendous professionals in this area. And I just went on their website, found the area where it said contact us and request a speaker, and I have someone coming in next week from the club. I've done the same thing with the Audubon Society and with other groups, and I've had really wonderful people come meet my kids. And I always use that as an opportunity to discuss careers, like how did you get interested in this and what did you do to sort of light a fire under my students about what they're going to be doing one day in the future. And that's it. Now we're open for questions.
Thanks, Kate.
So feel free to put your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask your question aloud. We had a question earlier from Katie Bush about what kinds of critters are around this time of year.
Okay, well, I know a slide's coming up about this part. So what's
Oh no, it seems like Katie's saying no. Oh, that was her thought. Oh, sorry, Katie. I thought you were asking the question.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say that a lot of people walk into the pollinator gardens and they want to clear them out, and there's
that's another thing.
actually
Yeah, we will be talking about that.
a lot of stuff. But so I won't go into much detail there, but you know, like my kids today in our school property, we're looking at birds and squirrels. And again, that's why I love lichen, because that's just year round. So if you're running out of things this time of year, that's a good one to pull in. Do you have any?
It's hard to think of things that you might be seeing during the day.
I know bats are great, but you're not gonna have
At
them-
dusk, you
Yeah,
won't see them at
you
dusk.
won't have them with you for
Yeah.
the bats. But squirrels are actually really interesting. I was just recently drilling down. I want to do a program on squirrels for my kids. There was actually a dearth of squirrels, and Theodore Roosevelt decided to bring squirrels back to DC, and he's responsible for the black squirrels. He brought them from Canada into the area, and they're actually part of our species, but that black morph was not commonly found around here. So yeah. Any
There are
other
also there are lots of birds that are only here in the winter too. So that's one of the nice features for those of you who use Merlin, that it'll show you when the birds are here, so you can tell the difference between the birds that are here year round or just the winter birds.
Absolutely. So this season, we're getting the birds that are coming, this is their southern range. And they're coming from further north. And then then we have the warblers coming through in the early spring. And then we have different birds in the summer, although we also have some year-round birds. But yeah, that's a great point. We have some visiting birds at this point.
I think this is a good time to also see bluebirds. I tend to see more of them at this time of year than others. They are definitely noticeable in the landscape. And I don't know if it was you, Allie, were you talking about seeing them on nesting boxes?
Yeah, I've been seeing them checking out nest boxes the last few weeks, getting a head start on spring. Yeah, Benjamin says he saw some on their boxes today.
Oh, are people seeing Orioles this time of year? And I see leaf oranges out for them. I've never heard. That's really cool.
So I don't know, Allie, I was going to ask you, maybe you could make a comment or two about the types of food sources that are really good for birds, and to emphasize having them on school grounds.
I mean, Merlin is my favorite resource for birds. The Sound ID has gotten a lot better, and it's very easy to use. So I think for ID, that's what I would use. I know I don't have any specific resources for feeding, although I think the Merlin is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they have information if you search on their websites about recommendations for feeders and types of seeds for depending on the kinds of birds you want to attract.
Right.
So you could look into that.
So one of the links that's going to come up is the local Northern Virginia Audubon Society just did a program on feeder watch. It was actually a program about winter birding, and a chunk of it was feeder watch. And they discussed in wonderful detail the types of bird feeders, where to get them, bird seed. They even had hints about, because I'm always trying to not attract rodents to my bird feeders, to use hot, spicy bird seed and where to purchase that, because the birds like it and the mammals don't. So that's going to be a link provided if anybody wants to delve in a little deeper into birding.
Yeah, that will be in the resources at the end.
And then I want to give a shout out to the Great Falls Bird Walk that's been going on for 30 years. It's a citizen science project. There's always 3 naturalists there, and they're really accustomed to onboarding new people. And they have a ton of regulars that come out with cameras. It's amazing. So it meets at Great Falls National Park, Sundays at 8 a.m. in the parking lot. And it's a 2-hour route, and if you want to add an extra hour, you can't, but after 2 hours, you end up back in that parking lot, and you can head home if you want to.
Okay, thanks. That's lots of great resources and ideas for things to do.
And
And-
Karen, we do have, Brooke has her,
Oh, okay.
Brooke, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, I didn't, I was, people had asked about animals in the winter and also birds. So, I just was gonna make a comment. I know that, if you plant things, so one of the things we talk about, or I talk about with my students, but I also talk about it when I talk to people at the park who come to the park, is that what's really interesting about winter berries is they're actually higher content in fat than
Right.
your spring and summer berries, and it's because the animals need the fat content. So they actually will often, you'll sometimes see winter berries earlier in the year, not super early, but earlier than winter, I should say, like fall. And the birds will ignore them a lot of times until they're the last ones available because they don't taste as good, but they actually need that fat. And so you can plant things that maybe produce that in your gardens. The other thing about rodents is we don't want rodents, but what's kind of cool about rodents is sometimes when you get rodents, you get hawks, you get raptors. And so you actually end up getting a whole bunch of other animals that you weren't necessarily, like if you feed the birds, you feed the rodents. If you feed them, you feed the birds that eat the birds or eat the rodents because they show up. So there's that factor too. But and then also birds to see if you happen to have, and I don't know who here has any kind of pond or lake near their, I know some schools have them on their sites, but ducks are fantastic during like January, February, to find if you happen to have them nearby, or a water source even nearby. It doesn't have to be on your school property. Sometimes they'll show up, and it's because they're getting prepared to either they've already paired up or they're about to pair up, and then they'll go off and have their babies. So there's those things too, but also a lot of evidence for deer and foxes and things like that are around.
Those are great points, Brooke, too. And I think that was kind of the point I was trying to get around in terms of providing food sources for birds on school property and the types of native plants that you can plant that are berry bearing. We had an interesting discussion about the difference between some of the berries that are provided by things that are invasive, like multiflora rose, versus say something that's provided by a native viburnum. And you're right. I mean, the nutrient content on the invasive plants is far less than that on the native plants that support our native bird species. So thank you for making that point.
Kate, could you speak to how one becomes a master naturalist? Like what sort of training, what's the process like to become a master naturalist?
So they love teachers. So you're lucky because it's gotten so popular. There's a lot of wait lists for the program. So you apply, just check the Fairfax, and you can also apply in Arlington, Prince William. You don't have to be in the county you live in. And you put in your application, just watch that date because it's always earlier than you think. If you're accepted and showing past interest, like what you're doing here is a huge indicator that you have real interest. Then I say it feels like one college credit, like one class, sorry. So like a 3-credit college class for one semester. And you'll have classes once a week in Arlington, it's Zoom. And then you have 4 weekend field trips that you go on. And actually you don't want to miss those because those are the most fun events that there are. And that's it. So they've tried to make it pretty streamlined. You learn a lot, you meet great people, you have a good understanding of places like Earth Sangha and Barcroft and the plants there. So you leave with a lot of information, Audubon at home, things that get a little bit in the weeds to describe to people just casually. You really start to absorb all that information. And then you have a requirement of 40 hours of volunteer experience. But if you do 1 hour a year, you stay in the system. But the goal is 40. And I think all the type of work you're doing here would qualify as your education outreach work. So
I think the window is either open or opening soon for if you're interested in becoming a master naturalist, that you can apply for that for this program.
Yeah, there's 2 sessions a year. There's a spring session and a fall session. So probably right around now, they're opening up the sessions for the spring. Yeah.
Katie had, okay, she actually, I'm interpreting correctly this time, that she had a question about the berries that were mentioned and if they're produced in higher quantities, if it's going to be a harsh winter, if there's any correlation there.
That's interesting because we hear the same thing about acorns. And my understanding of it is that they don't predict a future event, but are more in line with what has happened in the past. So nutrient supply, water supply, weather conditions probably contribute more to it than what's going to happen in the future as a predictive, from a predictive standpoint. I hope that makes sense because it's one of those things that you hear a lot. So.
I think those are all the questions.
Great. Okay, so I guess we can move on to the next topic. And we're going to circle back around into the gardens. And we'll spend a little time in the pollinator garden in winter. So I am sure that many of you have included pollinator gardens in your school landscapes, whether you inherited them or did them yourselves. Whether they may have been installed in a courtyard or perhaps in conjunction through the R3 plantings with Fairfax County's stormwater management program. At any rate, one of the things that frequently becomes an area of concern at this time of year is the appearance of pollinator gardens. We are really trying to educate people more about the benefit of leaving these gardens as is through the winter and into the early and sometimes even mid-spring. I know that there's a lot of pushback sometimes because people think they look unkempt or untidy, but honestly, I think there's a real lack of understanding of what's going on in this habitat area during the winter. So one of the things, and these are points that if you are having conversations with your admin or other people on your staff about what's going on with these gardens, it's really important to point out that not all pollinators and beneficial insects have flown south for the winter. So a lot of them are right smack dab in the middle of those pollinator gardens now, and they are overwintering there, even though we can't see them, they're there. So one of the most valuable things that you can do to support those pollinators that we all want to see come spring, along with other invertebrates, is to provide them with that winter cover that they need in the form of some fallen leaves and standing dead plant material. So not only do they overwinter, but many insects are going to complete their life cycle in that leaf litter and in those vacant plant material or stems, flower stems, and in some brush piles, branches. And the other thing too, even in some of the bare patches of soil, we will have bees that are going to be burrowing and overwintering. So just to give you an example, and it might be beneficial for you to have this information kind of in your hip pocket to point out that some of the things that are still residing there through the winter are things like our solitary native bees, which do not live in hives, but tend to live in nests that they will create either in those flower stems or underground, things like your mason bee or leafcutter bee, which really create amazing little nests within which to lay their eggs. The other things that will be overwintering in these areas are things like luna moths and even swallowtails. And the interesting thing about those insects are that they will form a chrysalis or a cocoon that they attach to a dried out leaf, and they are actually camouflaged. So if you are out there raking up those leaves, you probably are unaware that you're raking up a lot of future swallowtails and luna moths. And bumblebees as well, they create underground nests and brush piles. So you can see that there's a bunch of stuff that we look forward to seeing and that are really important pollinators that are going to be overwintering in these areas. And aside from pollinators, there are other insects, things like fireflies, other beetles, and different types of, like I said, different invertebrates, and even some amphibians and reptiles may be making their homes there as well. So I wanted to also mention, some of them, okay, thanks, Sally. I wanted to mention too, particularly this year, there was a lot of buzz, a lot of attention being paid to Leave the Leaves advocacy, and two organizations I know in particular that were promoting that were the Xerces Society, which is for the conservation of invertebrates, and also the National Wildlife Federation. There were a lot of articles that were written encouraging people to leave the leaves, and they were not necessarily promoting leaving them all over the sidewalk or what have you, but rather than bagging them up and taking them off of your property was to rake them into garden beds, like you would see in the picture on the left there, and let them stay there. Now, if one of the other suggestions was, if you do run into problems with some of things looking so unkempt that you're being forced to cut some of it down, you can still bundle up some of that dead plant material and leave it there, because the insects will still find it and still be there. The point is to not bag it up and throw it away, because you're throwing the pollinators away as well. So we were also talking about another way to protect your pollinator gardens from being cut down, either intentionally or inadvertently. It happens both ways. Is to provide some signage, to provide informational signage that educates people about the reason why the garden looks the way it does, and also to have signs created for no-mow zones. And I saw Allie pop a comment up there. This is just one example of one, but facilities will they provide the signs, Allie? Is that correct?
They'll provide and install them.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
They will provide and install.
And install them. So the thing that gets tricky about protecting these pollinator gardens is, for example, if you have one in a courtyard area where maybe it's not getting mowed down, but you have some custodial staff that are responsible for the care and maintenance of that area, they may come in without knowing and attack it with weed whacker. So there, it's important to maybe have a conversation or create a relationship with your custodial staff so that they too understand the purpose of leaving that garden the way it is through the winter. And you want to try and leave it into the spring until you start seeing some of these insects emerge. And you can cut some of it back a bit, but you don't want to be cutting it back down to the ground. Some of these bees will be laying their eggs in those hollow tubes, even in early spring. The other thing I want to point out, and many people may not know, is that if you do have a pollinator garden, and this is probably true of the R3 plantings that have been done on school properties, they tend to be out in more open areas and in fields, some of them adjacent to athletic fields. They're planted around storm drain areas. And I think there's been a good effort made to make sure that these areas that are subject to mowing contracts, they're not being mowed by your school staff, but the contractors who come in and maintain those areas, that they follow a map. And I know through R3, they are trying to make sure that those areas are indicated on the mow maps, and so that the mowers know to leave those areas alone. One way you can check to see if a pollinator garden in one of those areas is designated as a no-mow area is to go to the employee hub, and you can check on the, I think it's a grounds, let's see what it is. There's a contracting mowing program in the grounds operations site on the hub, and you can check to see if that area has been delineated as a no-mow zone. And if it has not, I'm not sure, Allie, what would be the procedure to take to make sure that that would be indicated, who would they contact?
You can contact mowing@fcps.edu, and that email address is in my comment in the chat too, but they can help with both mowing map updates and if you want to request a no mow sign. And I'll add too that their no mow sign does not have as much detail. It's not as educational as the ones that are pictured here. So that might be something that's something that we've talked about, is updating them so that they do have more information. But in the meantime, that might be a good project to do with students too, is to create a supplemental sign that has more details about why your garden looks the way it does in the winter.
Okay, and so for the last topic we're going to delve into around the garden is on the next slide. And we're going to talk about a bit about winter sowing with milk jug greenhouses. So again, oftentimes people are unaware that cold weather is an ideal time to grow some crops, and some of you may have attended the fall PD on fall gardening and learned about cool weather plants and the sorts of things that you could grow in the fall. Now, at the time that we had that PD, it was getting a little bit late in the season, but perhaps next year we can get an earlier start and get some of those cool weather plants that you can plant in the spring, but you can also plant in the fall. The difference is going to be is that when we were talking about fall gardening and planting cool weather vegetables, we were moving into a period of declining daylight. So it kind of limited the types of cool weather vegetables that you could grow. But pretty soon we're going to be on the other side of the solstice and daylight will be increasing again. Now it's going to be colder, but again, there are plants that you can start growing and growing them outdoors, which was actually going to be beneficial to the plant. They'll be hardier and you won't have to worry about hardening them off if you're starting them inside. They'll already be started outside. So things like that we probably wouldn't have started growing later this fall, like broccoli or cauliflower, which would have taken too many days to reach maturity. You can start early, probably right after the winter break, and they will be ready by mid-spring, which is ideal because those cool weather vegetables do not do very well once the temperature gets too warm. So we're going to watch a short video, and it's really done well. This person will demonstrate to you how you can use milk jugs, but you can use other containers other than milk jugs as well. You can use things like plastic salad clamshells. It's another way to use them rather than throwing them away, as long as it has a deep recess to put in enough soil. Those types of containers will work, whether they're juice bottles or soda bottles or milk containers. They'll all work pretty well. So we'll take a look at this video, and she not only describes how to create these milk jug greenhouses, but also does a pretty good job of recommending the types of plants that you can plant in. And not all of them are edible. I mean, it's great to start growing things like milkweed and some of our other native plants, which do require going through a cold phase and in order to germinate. So you can go ahead and play the video. Okay. The sound. That's just kind of.
Certain flowers, vegetables, and herbs are. Hi, I'm Nikki Jabor, and today I want to talk about winter sowing. Winter sowing is a seed starting technique where the seeds of certain flowers, vegetables, and herbs are planted outdoors in containers in late fall or winter. The cold weather stratifies the seeds and prompts germination when the time is right. There are many benefits to winter sowing. First, it's an easy way to start many types of plants without going to the trouble of indoor seed starting. It's also budget-friendly, as there's no need to invest in grow lights or pots and seeding trays. Most gardeners use recycled items like milk and water jugs, soda bottles, or salad containers for winter sowing. These containers act as miniature greenhouses and should be deep enough to hold at least 3 to 4 inches of potting mix and tall enough to accommodate the growing seedlings. Other supplies you'll need for winter sowing include seed starting mix or an all-purpose potting soil, labels, and a waterproof marker, duct tape and scissors, and of course something sharp to poke holes in the bottoms of the containers. As you may have guessed from the name, winter sowing is done during the cold months of winter. I usually sow seeds in January, once the holidays have passed and my seed orders have arrived. If you plant too early in autumn, the seeds may sprout and not survive the winter. On the other hand, if you wait too late in winter, there may not be enough cold weather left to stratify the seeds. Most types of seeds need several months of cold, moist conditions to prompt germination. When you're ready to sow, start by preparing the containers. I poke drainage holes in the bottoms of my containers using a drill, pointed screwdriver, or old steak knife. Be very careful and wear safety glasses for this step. I also add ventilation holes to the tops of the containers to allow warm air to vent on mild days. If planting in milk jugs or soda bottles, the next step is to make a cut about 4 inches up from the bottom of the container. Using scissors, cut almost the entire way around the container, leaving a small hinge at the back. This allows the greenhouse to open and close. Add several inches of moist potting mix to the container and plant the seeds at the recommended depths. Check the seed packet for specific seeding depth information. Record the plant type, variety, and sowing date on a tag and tuck it inside. Using duct tape, close and seal the jug or container. I also write down the plant type and date on the outside surface with a waterproof marker. Once all the seeds are planted, place the containers outdoors in a sunny but sheltered spot, like a deck, patio, alongside a garden shed, or next to a raised bed. As the weeks and months pass, the containers will likely be covered with snow. That's fine, as you want the winter weather to work its magic. Remove the caps every couple of weeks to make sure the potting mix is still moist. If it seems dry, sprinkle in some water. As winter turns to spring, the seeds will germinate and begin to grow. At this point, keep a close eye on soil moisture, watering when necessary. And when the outdoor conditions are right, transplant the seedlings into the garden. Winter sowing is a technique that's very effective in growing a wide range of plants, like lupins, black-eyed Susies, coneflowers, and milkweed. I also use it to start pansies, snapdragons, marigolds, and calendula. And there are many edibles you can winter sow, including cabbage, kale, broccoli, onions, leeks, parsley, cilantro, lettuce, and bok choy. Happy growing!
Okay, so you can see that's a pretty easy technique and it's pretty inexpensive. And if anyone is interested in experimenting with that and would like to get some cool weather seeds, I have retained quite a few varieties. So you can just email me and I'm happy to send some out to you via Pony. And I'm curious to see how you do. Be sure if you do this to document what you're doing and the dates and times and places and types of seeds that you're growing, and some pictures would be great too. I'd love to see that documented. And that is about all I have to say. But so I am curious to know if you have any questions, not only about pollinator gardens or winter sowing or any of the other topics, or any comments about the other topics, or something perhaps that was not covered that you would like to know about. You can take this time to put it in the chat or raise your hand.
And Karen, I'll go ahead and add a question, which is, do you have a recommendation for if people get pushback on having a sort of messy looking pollinator garden? Good strategies for dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a common comment that we hear. And, you know, I think that there are two things that I would suggest. I mean, one of them is to really emphasize the role of a pollinator garden and the fact that it is a habitat all year long, and that some of what's provided in the winter months between the leaf litter and also those spent flower stems are important places for insects and pollinators to overwinter and also complete their life cycles. Beyond that, one of the things, again, I've been reading through some recommendations because I know it is a challenge at some schools. And if you really get a lot of pushback and there's, there really is a desire to have that area cleaned up, I think the best thing that you could do is, in the short term, is maybe do a modified cleanup. One of the things that I had seen suggested is, for example, with all of the tall growth, is just to maybe cut some of those stems back to maybe 8 to 10 inches and take whatever is left and bundle it and make a brush pile out of it, because what's been found is that the insects will still be there, but again, you may be able to make that area look a little bit tidier. But I would really advise against totally clearing it out, because you're basically taking all the pollinators out right along with it. That's the best I can say. I mean, if you're going to have a pollinator garden, it really is, it's part of having a pollinator garden, I think, is to recognize that it's going to look like that part of the year. In one of the pictures that I showed, it was very interesting. There was a huge pollinator meadow in the picture that is right along Bear and Cameron Parkway in Reston. And I'd say it's probably about a mile long. And it's interesting to see that that was a little bit earlier in the fall, but I venture to guess that it is all still standing like that right now. And I think you're going to be seeing more of that. There's just a lot of discussion taking place, because I know that it's been a concern raised by schools and neighborhoods and what have you. And I'll share with you too. One of the things that I noticed the other day, well, two things that I've been noticing just in neighborhoods, in shopping areas, for example, that there's more of an effort to be planting native plants in those median strips. And I have been noticing even in office complexes that leaves are being raked into the garden beds. I noticed it the other day, and it was striking because that's not something that you normally see in an office complex.
Yeah.
One of the questions was, is there a time to clean it out?
Yeah, there is a time to clean it out. You want to start waiting until some of the first buds are leaving out, some of the early flower buds. Like I can probably, I'm trying to think of how to share this information, but some of the earlier flowering trees, they're not cherry trees, they're probably like the purple leaf plums and sort of things like that. And, again, going back to that topic of phenological events, some of the things that we had typically been seeing happening later in terms of bloom and bud times have been happening earlier. So it's going to be one of those things. I can't say by such and such a date you should do it. You have to pay attention to what's happening in the rest of the environment, because that is going to have an impact on when those insects are going to be emerging. So it's more temperature dependent than calendar dependent. It's probably what I would say. So we'll have to watch it and see what happens this year. It's one of those things. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Allie.
Oh, I was just going to add, a couple of people have shared in the chat that they've had, sounds like they've had some success making posters to go near the garden that explain some of the benefits of the winter garden. I like Sarah's example was something along the lines of, pardon our mess, our gardens are home for sleeping insects and birds.
Yeah, great. Well, that's the other thing about pollinator gardens too, that I think gets overlooked, because a lot of those flowers have seed heads on it. So they're also a food source for the birds. And if I were doing some birding, I would be kind of checking that area out, because you probably see them visiting around there. So it's not only supporting the pollinators, it's supporting other animal life as well.
Can you share some more also about, you mentioned the R3 program for those who aren't familiar with that. Could you share a little bit more?
Sure. So we have been partnering for a couple of years now with the Stormwater Management Department over at Public Works, Fairfax County Public Works. And they have a program where they are working with schools to install gardens around stormwater drains to improve water quality. They are really serving dual purposes by by improving water quality, and because they're kind of like rain gardens, but they're also pollinator gardens as well. So the plants that are being planted in those areas are specifically chosen because they are very good at absorbing water, and it mitigates any stormwater surges or flooding. So there is a website on the Fairfax County Public Works website about the R3 program where you can sign up if you're interested, and we'll come out to take a look and evaluate your school grounds to see if there is a place that is a good candidate for the garden to be installed. The great thing about the program is that they do provide all of the plants and a good deal of the labor. They come out and actually do all of the drilling, augering all the holes for the plants, but the students are the ones who actually do the planting. And it is a great opportunity for our students to not only get outside and do that activity, but it also enhances their understanding of the role of this type of garden in the environment. I will just caution everybody that the program is immensely popular. And so I believe there is a waiting list. I'm not sure what it is at this point, but they typically schedule, I believe, 4 planting events in the fall and 4 in the spring. So if you're interested, I would still make the inquiry. I would still get my name on the list. And I know that they are wonderful working with students. They are incredibly prepared. They provide wonderful plants for your school gardens. And honestly, as this program continues, we are in the midst of transforming our school gardens. But that being said, again, they are going to be pollinator gardens, and it's going to be something, if your school is interested in and having one installed, there needs to be an understanding of what the garden will look like throughout the course of the year.
Thanks, Karen. Does anyone else have questions or comments, ideas, things you are thinking about getting outside over the winter?
Now, it's a lot of different things to look at, and I'm hoping that for some of you who may not have had that many opportunities to spend time observing what's going on in the winter, that it spurs your curiosity and you get a chance to take note. It's definitely different from any other season, and it has its own intrigue and beauty. And I highly recommend your students getting outside. And plus, the fact being out in cold weather is invigorating and a lot of fun. So if no one has any questions or comments or ideas, which I'd also love to hear, we can probably move to the next slide. So we're going to just do a little idea blizzard. And again, it's going to be a little bit of a breakout for another 10 minutes, and want to know what your next move is based on what you heard and saw in this presentation. And think about ideas for using the winter landscape as a learning tool. And great, thanks for the suggestions for books to read as well. And with that, I think we can go ahead and re-enter our breakout rooms.
So in the breakout room, you're going to be in a slightly larger group, and the idea is to just have that time to connect with one another and talk about what this might look like at your school, or what has worked well for you, or even to present the challenges that you're having at your school, because we are surrounded by experts in this Zoom overall, not just our great speakers, but also all of you who've been doing this work for a lot of years and might have ideas to share with others. I'm going to drop in the chat Google Doc, a place to document your learning. And when we share this slide deck on Schoology, we will incorporate those slides in. So even if someone didn't have the advantage of being in a group with you, they are able to really see all the ideas.
Thanks, Chrissy.
Yep. And the breakout rooms, like Karen said, will be about 10 minutes. Enjoy.
Oh, that's what I'm following.
So, yeah. But he's like 9, so. But listen, I had to read one of his books for a class. He makes Doug look like a spring chicken. He might not even be around at this point. It's a little bit more like San County Almanac. Like he took a big piece of land, just decided to see what happened when he brought it back to life, and then, but in the Northeast. Yes.
So lots of material.
Yeah. Okay, so who's Allie?
She is our, she works with Kitchen Green. She's our facilities.
That's what I was guessing after a while. I was like, I think she's like,
Yeah.
So okay.
I think I met you briefly at C's in the spring.
Right, that's right.
Okay.
Well, that's right, that we roll at C's. Forgot
Yeah.
about that.
So it's nice to be with you here this evening. Thanks for coming and sharing with everyone.
Yeah, I just want to mention Nature Forward has a bookstore, and in their bookstore they have a pretty low tech sign about, I took a photo of it once and I should have just bought one, but you could put it in your garden and it has a scan code on it, but it says this is why this garden looks this way, and then it gives information. And when I bump into that photo again, I'll try to get it over.
Yeah,
here.
that's the sort of thing, Ally, I wish we could work on creating too, as far as the no mow sign is concerned.
I think we can, like Grounds was open to having, maybe not having as much information on the sign, but having a QR code that would go to like a page on our website with more information and some pictures of gardens in the winter.
I would love to have it, have that resource just show what the garden looks like in each season, so people understand what is happening.
Hey, Chrissy, do you want to pause recording? While they're in breakouts.
Yep.
It's also in the chat. And so this is how we record your attendance, because people get in through different ways. So even if you entered through my PDE, we're going to ask that you complete this exit ticket, both for reflection on tonight's learning and so that we know that you were here. If you had a question that was not answered during the session, there is a place on the exit ticket for you to ask that, and we will follow up within the next week at the longest for any questions, or if there was a question you just didn't want to throw out to the whole group, but this brought up some new questions for you, we're happy to get back to you. So we ask you to complete that exit ticket. Thank you so much for taking time. I know December can be a really busy month for everyone, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us and learn a little bit about cold weather learning, and hopefully you found some inspiration for yourself and to get your students outside during a different time of year to see the world and learn in a different way. So once you complete the exit ticket, many thanks to Karen and Kate Carey, who joined us tonight and did all of the planning for this. We truly value, I know many of you have gotten to work with some of them at your school and really value their expertise. So once you complete the exit ticket, you are welcome to sign off and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.